I'm Mike Berners-Lee. I'm a professor at Lancaster University. I'm also the director of Small World Consulting, which helps organizations to respond to the climate and environmental emergency. And I've also written some books, including How Bad a Banana is the Carbon Footprint of Everything, and more recently, There Is No Planet B. And it's a great pleasure to be talking to you at Amplifi in Tunbridge Wells about what businesses can do about the situation that we find ourselves in. What are the key challenges that we find ourselves up against? We hear about a climate emergency and the need to stay within 1.5 degrees of temperature warming since pre-industrial levels. And it looks like we're tottering on the edge of crossing that threshold right now. And definitely, it looks almost unthinkable that we won't go through that threshold this decade. And what we don't hear so much about is the fact that actually we're not just traveling towards a climate emergency, we're accelerating towards it. In other words, every year, the amount that we put extra greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is more than the amount that we increased it by the year before. So it's not just that we're not getting anywhere or we're not getting anywhere fast enough yet, we're actually making things worse by a larger amount every year than we did the year before. And it's not just a climate emergency, it's a much wider ecological emergency than that. We don't talk about biodiversity as much, but actually the fact that we're hemorrhaging our biodiversity is just as much a threat for humanity as climate change is. So I would say that we are accelerating towards a polycrisis at the moment. And we know that we've had some wild weather in 2023, but what I want to emphasize is that we heard about some record-breaking temperatures and so on, but we broke those records by enormous amounts. So, for example, the average global temperature in September wasn't just a little bit higher than since records began; it was an enormous 0.5 degree higher. And the amount of Antarctic sea ice that there was last year in August wasn't just a little bit less than there's ever been in an August on record. It was 11% less. That's an incredibly large amount. So that's like if somebody broke the 100-meter sprint record by a hundredth of a second, you'd think that's impressive. But if they broke it by a whole second, you'd really say, well, what's going on? Something's not right. So we are in a situation in which we're heading for what could be a catastrophe, and what the scientific community is talking about more and more and really getting quite alarmed about is the possibility of cascading tipping points, by which I mean one symptom of the climate change reinforcing another symptom, which goes and reinforces another symptom. And between them all, they actually precipitate a situation in which it doesn't matter what humans do, we're facing a step change in the climate, which could be very uncomfortable indeed for the whole of humanity, whatever country you're in, however well off you are. And so I think if we're not feeling nervous, we absolutely should be feeling really, really pretty nervous at the moment. When do we need to take action? We needed to take much stronger action decades ago. And where we're at now is we absolutely need to take very strong action, all of us right now. And some people ask me, where does the change come from? Who needs to go first? And the answer is, it's a big systemic change. It involves governments, it involves businesses, it involves the public, it involves absolutely everybody. And where does the leadership come from? It comes from whoever can provide it. So it's not about businesses waiting for their customers to get behind them and for the government to give them the right opportunities. It's not about governments waiting for businesses and the public to care enough. And it's not about the public sitting back and waiting for businesses and the government. It's about everybody doing what they can, because I think when the system changes, it will all change at once. And that's what's so interesting about a collaboration of local businesses, is that together you can have some leverage which can actually have influence over the whole system. What does it look like for a business to be part of the solution to the situation we're in? For me, it's a very holistic thing. So this agenda affects everything that every business says, thinks, and does. And the biggest question, I think, for every business to ask is, what is our fundamental business model? And are the goods and services that we're providing in line with transition towards a more sustainable future? And that's a more important question to ask than, for example, what's our carbon footprint and how can we cut it? So, and in the businesses that I work with, the killer question to ask usually is, if the world started making a transition towards a much more sustainable economy, would that represent an overall opportunity or threat for this business? And if the answer is that overall it would be a threat, then the most urgent challenge for your business is to change the business model until such time as that becomes an opportunity. And then when you've done that, it's much easier for everything you do around sustainability to become coherent. And then you can start looking at other important things like, oh yeah, cutting your carbon footprint, which of course involves your whole supply chain. So that's engaging with your suppliers, but it's also the whole narrative that you have with your customers. Talk to them about the climate emergency and wider ecological emergency that we're in, and just how urgent it is to take really strong action right now, because that's a narrative that we're not hearing anything like enough of. And finally, ask yourselves, well, what are all the other areas in which we might be able to exert some influence? So how do we lobby our local MP? How do we lobby government more widely? And I think the more I look at this, the more I am coming to the view that one of the critical things to push for is actually an environment of honest business and honest politics and honest media, for that matter, as well. So push in every way you can to ask for, insist on, and reward honesty from all our politicians. And in the field of business, just please avoid all forms of greenwash, however subtle and sophisticated they might be. Avoid all greenwash, and just be absolutely honest about what the situation you're in is and what you're doing in response to it. People value and respect honesty increasingly much more than kind of unrealistic stories about how perfect you are, because none of us are perfect on this agenda. Is it realistic to think that we can make a difference? I think this is a question which all of us need to ask seriously, because if we look at the true nature of the climate and ecological emergency that we face, it is a global systemic challenge. And each one of us is just 1/8 billionth of the problem and the solution. And even if we have a business, then it's a bit higher than that. But it's easy to think, well, I'm just such a small speck, maybe there's nothing I can do. And I think the answer is that it's true that probably none of us can single-handedly change the whole world. Although you've only got to look at the example of Greta Thunberg to see how much influence one person can have, even from the most powerless of platforms, where she started out from. So, but I think the way to think about it is, if I ask the questions, how can I exert the maximum leverage on this global systemic problem? I think what you find is that actually we can all have quite a bit of leverage, and especially if we collaborate and become a group of businesses that are working together. And especially if we ask much bigger questions than just, what's our carbon footprint? Not that that's not important, but much bigger questions like, how can we influence the politics that's going on? How can we influence the whole business environment? What should we be lobbying for? How can we influence the media? How can we influence the culture that we're in? How do we influence our customers and our supply chain? Those bigger questions, I think, are really how you can have leverage and much more agency than most businesses initially think that they can have. And so that's why Amplifi is potentially such a great initiative. My final thoughts are that we are in a race between tipping points now. The scientific community really is getting very concerned, and I would say alarmed, about the possibilities that we are crashing through tipping points now that we can never come back from, that could have, really very, very serious consequences for humanity. Uh, I don't want to be doom and gloomy about this, but we're facing enormous risk at the moment. So have we crossed those tipping points yet? Probably not quite, but we don't know that for sure. So we absolutely do need fast action. And it's a race against tipping points, because the other tipping point is the big societal wake up. And that's what you can really push for now. And I think at the moment, it takes some real strength to hold on to and remember the situation that we're in, because the science is absolutely clear cut. We should be taking very, very strong action about that. The science couldn't be clearer. And yet, if you turn on Radio 4 in the morning, you'll sometimes hear a little bit about climate, but you will not pick up an overall flavour that this is something that should be affecting how do we go to work, and everything about how we go to work, and how we live our lives. And so it takes a lot of strength to remember that that's the environment we're in, and everything we say and do should be geared around that. And what you can do in Amplifi as a community is you can help each other to keep that mindset. We are not getting it from our mainstream media. We are getting it from the scientific community, but most of the time we don't hear enough from that, so that it doesn't stay strong in our minds. But what we can do is keep reminding each other and kind of holding each other to it. And that's maybe that's the strongest thing that you can actually do at Amplifi. So I just want to say good luck with everything you're doing, and thank you for your efforts.